Good morning. Thank you once again for joining us on this chilly Sunday morning for our video service. I don't have a whole lot to go over this morning. I just wanted to mention that the men's group will be meeting Monday night, 6:30 here at the Father's house. So if you want to be a part of that, show up. I'm pretty sure they're going to cook a meal. So if you're hungry and want some fellowship, stop by. Our ladies group is still meeting on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let me or Deanne Paradis know, and we'll get you hooked up. We're going to be starting a new study the first Thursday in February on the book of Amos, An Invitation to a Good Life by Jennifer Rothschild. So we'd love to have you be a part of it. That book is about $22. If you're interested in joining us, we'd love to have you do that. Today is our missions offering. So if you want to give your tithes and offerings or to the missions, you can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you'd like Pastor Carl or I to come by and pick up your tithes, we'd be happy to do that. I know Pastor Juan in Argentina is working diligently to get that church and that orphanage finished, so anything you can give would be greatly appreciated. That's really all I have to cover today. It was short and sweet, so we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl and see what he has to teach us.
Well, good morning, Father's House. How are you today? I bet you're having a good day. Wild card weekend for all you football fans. You know what that means for me? NASCAR is all the more close, so I'm kind of happy about that. Not that I dislike football, because I do like football, but probably not as much as some of you, that is for sure. Anyway, like Penny said, it's a cold season or front that's going through here. It's a little nippy out, not like it is in other places of the country. I understand that, so I'm not really complaining about it. But it's a little cold. But it's refreshing. The rains have kind of gone, although they might be coming back the end of this week. But that's just something that hopefully we'll get some, and just kind of keep our water storage going up the way that it should be going, and that would be a good thing for all of us. That's about all I got, other than to say that we're starting to now move into a different direction. We finished the book of James, and as I said, we would then begin to focus on the life of Jesus. And so it's kind of, as we get into this, the next couple of weeks, I'll begin to explain. The first part is just kind of laying out some different ideas that I want to lay out first before we look at the actual life of Jesus Christ and in the actions that he does, and the things that he says, and the things that he teaches. So this is going to be a different type of an involvement with Jesus. We're going to look at him through a different lens this time. And hopefully we'll be able to glean some things about his life that become a part of our life and things that we apply to ourselves today. It's easy for us to over-spiritualize things, isn't it? And so they don't really have any kind of a tangible connection to the world in which we live. And yet a real theology always has that. A real theology is always formed and fashioned in the midst of experience. Now, I could go on about that for a long time, and it would take a long time to explain that, and probably several books by other authors and stuff to explain how theology historically has been impacted by the culture in which we live, because with our theology and with our beliefs about God, we're always rubbing up against the world and different ideologies, concepts, values, and such. So it's it's always got this part to it where it has this anchor in reality. And Jesus was no different from us in that the thing about it was Jesus was anchored in the reality of his day. And through that, because of who he is, we have a lot of things that he has a lot of things that he can teach us concerning how we ought to apply it now today, as we are the ones that carry on the mission and the ministry of what it is that God in Jesus Christ started. So today I'm going to lay out some basic thoughts, ideas about Jesus, about who he is. And then next week, we're going to start looking we'll start kind of maybe breaking down a little bit more as we kind of look at Jesus' baptism and what that means. And then we're going to go into some other things. But I've got to start off this first part by asking the question, really, or all of us really asking this question: Who was and is Jesus Christ really? Was in the fact that he had this historical life which he lived in a human physical body, and then who he is in his resurrected state now. So who was Jesus and who is Jesus actually applies in this instance. So we've got to kind of go back to Scripture, and I want to kind of look and kind of pull back the veil on things that are familiar to us, but maybe things we haven't thought about in a while, about who Jesus Christ really was and who Jesus Christ really is in the eternal sense. Because remember that Jesus Christ existed as the Logos, we're going to talk about that, before the incarnation, right? And then after the incarnation and the resurrection, right? And then he ascended to heaven at the right hand of God. There's this motion of the beginning of Christ, the procession of Christ from God into the world, and then return to the Father. And so what does all of that mean, and how do we relate that in our own Christian context? I don't want to get into that too deeply, but I do want to lay kind of a foundation. So we have this concept of Jesus Christ bigger than, well, Jesus Christ is my Savior. He's my personal Lord and Savior. So we begin to see him a little bit on a deeper level. So to do that, we're going to go to the book of John, chapter 1, which I'm sure that most of you are familiar with. If not, maybe this will be an enlightening time for you as we kind of read through about 18 verses. So I'll start reading, and we'll just kind of talk about it. In the beginning was the Word, or Logos, really, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's interesting. He was in the beginning with God. We're talking about the Logos, or we're talking about the Christ to some extent. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. There was the true light, which, coming into the world, enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, "This was he who I have said, of whom I said, he who comes before me has a greater rank than I, for he existed before me. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten one, who is in the bosom of the Father, has explained him." So it has explained him. I think I dropped off that him there at the minute. So there's a couple of things that I want to bring to the front here as we kind of look at this person of Jesus Christ, who Jesus Christ was. So it says in this text, really, and it really is John's creation text. I mean, it really goes back to Genesis chapter 1, when you start talking about in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we're going back to in the beginning was the Word. So he's going back to the beginning of when the cosmos was created. And what this text is saying, that in the beginning, that the Logos was present, or the Word was present. Now, this Word is Jesus, not in his human flesh, but in his godly essence, if you would have it. So there's this part of God which we call the Son, the only begotten of the Son, right, who's full of grace and truth, we're talking about here. And so what we're talking here is we're talking about that in Jesus' divine nature, that nature existed before all of creation. As a matter of fact, what it's saying, that this mind that's going to infiltrate this human form of Jesus Christ, that all things were created through him, and Colossians says that all things are sustained by him. And so what we have is we have this idea of this cosmic Christ, who is the creator of all things and the sustainer of all things. That's the first thing. So that's called the logos, or the word. Now it's going to become important just kind of briefly. So stay with me here. The second thing here is that it says that he was the light and the light of all men, which would make sense that he was the life because he created all things. But this idea of light has to do with, and it really kind of has the idea with illumination, doesn't it? And it kind of has to do with the illumination of the mind, is what I want to talk about here. And that will become important as we kind of get into this. So the first thing that we know about Jesus is that he was pre-existent before he came and was in the incarnation and the body of Christ. And then we also know that John the Baptist kind of comes into this and says that John the Baptist is going to give a witness to Jesus Christ. And he's going to say that he existed before him. So even John the Baptist realizes this prior existence of the Logos that's there in the person of Jesus Christ. He's going to be a witness to that. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means next week. But the first thing we have the idea that he is the Logos, or the Word, the concept, or the idea, or the divine revelation of God, which would maybe be better. The second thing is that he's the life, he is the life, and that he's the light. Now this becomes important when we think about light. And the reason I want to say that is because when he's talking here about light, over here in verse 9, this is what it says concerning him being the light. There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, but the world did not know him. So the idea then, I don't know, this is going to be really hard to bring together, but I'm going to try to bring it together. Okay, when we talk about this idea of Christ being the light, I want to make that synonymous with the light of the intellect. Or it's the idea that God gives all men, every person, I mean all men and women, I guess all men and women and child, that God gives all of us the light of natural reason. That within ourselves we have the ability to reason, and that God has given that reasoning capacity to all men. And by that capacity, man can reason to the existence of God. But that's, so that's kind of really what's being talked about here. But I don't want to get too deep into that other than to say that this is kind of where we're headed. Jesus Christ in the Logos, the word, the concept, the idea, was prior to anything being created, and all things are created through him. The second thing is that in this ability to be able to create that, he put in men, every man and woman and child, the ability to reason, which would be the intellectual light that he's given us. That's what makes us different from other animals, is the idea of our reasoning capacity and how we can reason. And so we reason and we abstract different thoughts and things. We can think about God, we can relate to God, all of these different things, because God has given all creation, well, not really, I should say all of humanity, he has given us this natural ability, or this natural light of reason. The next thing that's interesting here is that, and then in doing that, is the idea now, as he's going to go back to talking about God created the heavens and the earth. And then when he created the heavens and the earth through Christ, through the Logos, and then he gave man the natural light to be able to discern these type of things. The next thing is in verse 14, it says, and the Word, or the Logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. Now this becomes important, because now what we have happening is we have this divine intellect that's now entering into human history. And in entering into human history, he's taking the form of a man. So what we have in Jesus Christ then is we have this God nature in him along with this human nature. So that's what we really call, why we talk about the hypostasis of Christ, having both a divine nature and also having a human nature, but still being just one being. Very unique. I mean, it's not like us. We have a human nature, but we don't have a divine nature. In the person of Christ, there was both the human nature, because he was birthed into the human race by Mary, and we have the divine nature, because it was the Word, or the Logos, or the nature of God, right, that became flesh. So when we're talking about Jesus, we're always talking about two different natures. He's got a human nature that responds one way and a divine nature that responds another way. And so we're going to kind of interplay with these two things about this idea of Christ in his humanity and Christ in his divinity as we go through this study for the next several months. But the next interesting thing about that is that after talking about him taking on this divine nature, it says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And the idea of what it says, and the word, this, I love this, and the word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. It's the idea of the pitching of a tent. It's almost like we've got this city of tents, and all of a sudden, here comes Jesus. In the midst of it, he pitches this tent, meaning that he wants to live with us. He wants to interact with us. So he enters into humanity to participate with creation. Now, he's not just doing it because he wants to do it, but because God has an ultimate plan that is going to be realized in Jesus Christ as the extension of creation and what he's doing with all of his creation. So the idea is that he's dwelling among us. But here's what's interesting when he says he dwelt among us. And we saw his glory as the only begotten from the Father. And he says, full of grace and truth. Now this becomes interesting. Because a lot of times we want to think about God. And a lot of times what we've done is we've made God this supreme lawgiver and judge. So much so that there's no real grace in him or truth in him. It's the idea that God is a punishing God and that God's going to demand of us what he's going to demand justly because we're lawbreakers. Yet what we're going to see here, and just here in the moment in this transition, is in looking at Jesus Christ, he's basically saying, or what the writer of this book, John, is saying is that there's a distinction between the Mosaic law, the law, how to respond to God and to others, and this distinction between Jesus. The law of Moses was what preceded Jesus, but when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, the law of Moses, even though it's still there in effect, has a much less dynamic effect than the idea of in Jesus Christ, there's grace and truth. So that becomes important, and I'll tie this all together by the end of what I really want to say here. And then it goes on to say, it says, John testified about him and cried out, saying, this was he whom I have said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. We talked about the preexistence of the Logos. That's what's being said here. But then it kind of comes into what I want to tie it all together with. In verse 16 it says, for of his fullness we have received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, and grace and truth were realized in Jesus Christ himself. Now, the grace that he's talking about here, about the fullness, right? For in his fullness we have received grace upon grace. It's the idea of, if we go back to this idea of that he's given us the light of natural reason, our natural reason is a grace that God gave us. In the person of Jesus Christ, there's going to be an additional grace, which is the grace that's found in Jesus Christ by way of divine revelation to reveal to us the heart of the Father. So we get grace upon grace. God graced us. He gave us the gift of grace of our natural intellect, whereby we can reason things about God. We can reason what morality ought to look like in our society and in our personal life. We can reason how to live a life that would be something that would be enjoyable and pleasing. But the second thing he's saying here is that Jesus coming, there's going to be a second dimension or addition of a grace that's going to be added to us. And that grace is going to be basically God's self-revelation to us concerning who the heart of the Father is in the expression of Jesus Christ. And this is where it all comes together. So I'm going to just kind of read this, and then we're going to kind of summarize a few things, and then we're going to close this out. Verse 19 then says, or let's go back to 17. It says, for the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth, there it is again, was realized through Jesus Christ. So you can see the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth were realized in Jesus Christ. As much as we can never live the law perfectly, which is the law we would basically sum up as the Ten Commandments. What we're saying is, but Jesus is coming with a new dimension, a new understanding of God that's going to be revealed in the nature or in the character of grace and truth. And we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. But then the next verse that he has to say kind of wraps it all together. And I love this verse. It says, now no one has seen the Father at any time. The only begotten God, who is Jesus Christ, who is in the bosom of the Father, which is Jesus Christ, has explained him or explained him to us. So what we've got here in Jesus, as we begin to start the study, and this is just kind of I guess you would call it an introduction or a preface to what we're going to study, is there's this understanding, first of all, that in Jesus Christ, his divine nature existed before it was enveloped into human form. That in the divine nature that we find in Christ, all things have been created, all things are held into existence, and the future all depends on this divine Logos. The second thing is that he's the giver of life and light. He's given us life in that he sustains us, but is the giver of light in that he has given us a natural intellect to be able to reason about God and about reality or this world in which we live. But then what happened is he says, it's almost like God saying, but I'm not quite done yet. I mean, that's the first motion or movement that I'm going to do, what I'm doing in humanity. But my next motion is I want to participate with humanity. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this Logos, which we now call the Son, and that divine character, that divine essence, I'm going to place in a human body where this word is going to become flesh, and he's going to pitch his tent. And so God is going to pitch his tent or live and dwell with man. In other words, he's going to be a God not just for the people, but a God of the people. He's going to live amongst us as one of us, which is a fascinating thought. But he says, but he's not going to come like Moses by this demanding of the law and this demanding of the fulfilling of the law, because we know that in Moses that can't be done. We cannot live the law perfectly. And so what's happening is he's going to come. And he's going to come full of grace, which is God's unmerited favor or God's favor. He's going to come with truth, with that which is absolutely true concerning who the Father is. And so he's going to give us this grace upon grace. But here's the main concept, all that I've just said, that becomes important in just laying this out, just briefly theologically speaking, is at the very end he says, no one has seen the Father except for, the Son, or the one who was in the bosom of the Father. And so what's going to happen is he now takes on this form of human flesh and becomes a God of the people and for the people. What Jesus Christ's mission is, according to John, as we get started here, is to explain the Father to us, to explain God to us. He's not putting him, the Father or God, he's not putting him in a place of lawgiver and judge. He's putting himself in the position of the Father who's in relation to us as the children of God. So what we have now is Jesus is going to explain the heart of the Father and what it means for us to possess the heart of the Father. And so we're going to look at different encounters in Jesus' life where we understand the divine mind and the human circumstance in which Jesus is going to operate. That's really kind of where I want to leave it today, other than just for us to think about the fact that it's fascinating to think that God desired to come and pitch his tent amongst us, to dwell with us, to live with us. And we find this locus in the person of Jesus Christ, who has both a divine nature and a human nature. As we begin to study or go through this study, it's going to be kind of evident as far as how Jesus approaches social situations, with such a different view than what the religious Pharisees do, the common people do, the Roman occupiers, the people in government do. And so we're going to see in Jesus this encounter with historical reality whereby he changes reality by his very words and actions and deeds. So that's all I really want to talk about today. I know it probably seems fragmented, but if you read through that text, maybe it will become clearer. And as we go through the study, it will become clearer. But it's just something that I had to start with so we understand a little bit about the fact that God came to dwell amongst us. And when Jesus came in the form of God, right, and when he came with this divine nature, that he came to explain to us who the Father is, the heart of the Father. And so that's what we're going to focus on during this study as we look at the life of Jesus. Well, I hope you'll think about it. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. And maybe I even confused myself. It's nothing that you can grasp easy, and you never really get a complete handle on it. It's nothing that comes into complete focus. It's always a little bit out of focus. When we talk about the Logos, it's always, you never come up with this clear definition, this clear understanding, because it's bigger than what we can know. Anyway, just final thoughts. Think about it this week, and next week we're gonna pick up with Jesus' baptism, and we're gonna be off and running. Well, God bless you. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week.